So we've seen through Mark's gospel that the road of discipleship is a road marked with suffering. Jesus has been beaten by the Sanhedrin and the guards, living out his earlier predictions of suffering. Early in the morning they bring him to Pontius Pilate for trial. The Sanhedrin had some religious authority but had to bring Jesus to Pilate to enforce a capital sentence. Pilate was Judea's governor, appointed by the Roman Emperor Tiberius. During the Jewish festivals he would come up to Jerusalem and keep an eye on the crowds. Now Rome wouldn't have cared about the Sanhedrin's charge of blasphemy, so they went with sedition. Jesus had claimed to be a king, which could be seen as a threat against Caesar's rule. Then Mark tells us about a custom where Pilate would normally release a prisoner requested by the people. We have precedent in the ancient world for releasing prisoners to gain political favor. Josephus tells us that when Herod the Great died, Archelaus cut taxes and released prisoners to win the support of his father's subjects. So Mark tells us that a man named Barabbas had been imprisoned for insurrection and murder. The crowd and the ruling priests want to have this guy released. Now Pilate sees nothing wrong with Jesus and seems to hope that he would be the one to be released. But the crowds insist and Pilate caves. The name Barabbas means son of a father. Jesus had just been praying to his father the night before. The true Son of God is dying as a substitute for a rebel and a murderer. The soldiers mock Jesus' royalty, dressing him in a purple robe and pushing a crown of thorns on his head. Remember in chapter 10 when James and John asked to sit on Jesus' left and right? They were so excited for the coming glory, but now that it was time to suffer, they were nowhere to be found. Now instead, it's two rebels crucified on the left and right of Jesus. And so now there's this dramatic irony where the king is lifted up. He's been crowned and led in procession through the city, and now the crucifixion serves as his enthronement. But his subjects have fled, even the Father seems to turn his face away. And we're left wondering, where is this promised kingdom? After all this journeying with Jesus, the disciples have failed their mission. As Jesus suffers, people walk by and mock him, telling him to save himself. And so darkness covers the land and Jesus cries out, "My God, why have you abandoned me?" He's quoting from Psalm 22 to express the deep anguish and rift from the Father's presence as he takes on the sins of the world. And then Mark describes the supernatural act of the temple curtain being torn in two from top to bottom. The symbolism is debated. Does the torn curtain represent God's judgment on the land, or does it show the opening of access to God through the new covenant with all believers? It's probably both. And then a Roman centurion says, "Truly this was God's Son." Now it could be that he meant this true statement as a sarcastic utterance mocking the dying king. Or it could be a heartfelt realization that Jesus had a special connection with God, a connection which introduced Mark's gospel and that developed throughout the book. Then Mark briefly mentions several women who had been following Jesus along the way. This would have been shocking in that day since most rabbis didn't allow women to be their disciples. Jesus opens the door to everyone. In fact, throughout Mark's gospel, the women are seen as the great exemplars of faith and service. While the male disciples are consistently portrayed as blind, confused, and deserting Jesus, the women are seen as these great faithful examples of discipleship. Now a rich man had a tomb that he wanted to offer Jesus. Pilate grants him Jesus' body and he wraps it in linen and places it in the tomb. Then a heavy stone is rolled against the tomb opening, sealing the end. The anointed Christ was dead.